In the part of Israel's history where they had kings, we have looked at kings from the northern country, which is Israel, and the southern country, which is Judah. You remember, they used to be one country, but they had a civil war and kind of split up. We are done talking about the kings of the northern country, Israel. We have just a few more kings to talk about in the southern country, which is Judah. Last week we covered 4 good kings in a row, and they were Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, whom you also know as Uzziah, and Jotham. 4 good kings in a row, not perfect kings, but good kings. This week we have Ahaz. And to help you remember that he is not a good king, his name kind of rhymes with Ahab, who was the really, really bad king on the other side. All right, so let's take a look at the life of Ahaz. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, which is the capital of Judah, which is the southern portion of God's people. He did not do what was right in the eyes of Yahweh like his father David did, but he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, because the people in the northern country and those kings were all really, really rotten, except for Jehu. Jehu was just rotten. Ahaz even made molten images for the Baals. There were different gods called Baal that people worship. And he burned incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his own sons as an offering, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the prophet of Israel. Imagine burning your own child as a sacrifice, hoping to gain favor of a God that you worship. Hezekiah, his son, who is the next king, escaped being burned by his father. Then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to wage war on Jerusalem, and they besieged Ahaz. Now, just by way of reminder, to besiege a city, to lay siege to it, you surrounded a walled city. You wouldn't let anybody come out of it, and you wouldn't let anybody go into it. That means the people in the city did not have a way of getting food. So they basically starved to death and died, or they surrendered to the army that was around them. Now, who has surrounded Jerusalem, where Ahaz lives? The army from Syria and the army from Israel. Now, wait a minute, Jim. I thought Syria had been attacking Israel. They weren't friends, and they were taking Israel's territory. Well, now they're friends, and they're ganging up on the country of Judah, and they're attacking the capital, which is Jerusalem. I'll explain why in just a minute. And the Lord said to Isaiah, yes, the same Isaiah that wrote that big book in the Old Testament that has 66 chapters. You're going to love that one. The Lord said to Isaiah, go forth and meet Ahaz. Ahaz, how do you do? I'm Isaiah. And say to him, listen to these words, take heed, be quiet, do not fear. Now let's put that in the vernacular that we speak today. Listen. Shut your mouth. Stop being afraid. Why would Ahaz be afraid? Because armies have surrounded Jerusalem, and they intend on killing Ahaz and everybody in the city. It's making them really scared. Have you ever tried to speak maybe to a woman like this who is absolutely paralyzed with fear? What do you say? Calm down. Calm down? How does that work? You guys have heard of these backpacking trips that I've taken people on. Well, one time we had a 14-year-old girl with us named Cassie. Cassie was a little chatterbox box, and she was getting oxygen through her ears, because I know she wasn't getting it through her mouth, because words kept coming out of her mouth, and I know nothing was going in. So we got to the day where we would stand on the edge of a cliff. They would hook us up to a rope, and we would back over the cliff. This is called rappelling. That's 120 feet up. You look down there. Whoa, that's a long way down. And so I had gone down first, and I was at the bottom, and a couple of other people had come down. Then it's Cassie's turn. So Cassie gets hooked into the rope, and she's just chattering away, and she backs over the cliff, and all of a sudden she becomes frightened out of her mind. And she starts screaming at the guide who had hooked her in. Get me out of this contraption. Get me up. Get me up. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. And she wasn't listening to a thing that he said. And so he reaches out and slaps her. And there was silence, and everybody held their breath. And Cassie looked at him and said, "Thank you." And she came down the cliff with no problem at all and wanted to do it again. I think Isaiah should probably have slapped Ahaz. Is there any reason for Christians to panic like that? So what? We're gonna die. Really, guys, to live is Christ, but to die is gain. It's something to look forward to. Anybody know what that is? That is LPD number 4, the USS Austin. You see where that number 4 is there on the hull? Well, if you drop down about halfway to where the black part is on the ship and go a little bit to the left where there's a couple of holes, well, that's where our compartment was. It was 4 decks down below the main deck. And at 1:30 in the morning, just after we had gone through the Straits of Gibraltar and were in the Mediterranean Sea, we smashed into a Japanese freighter, in case you're wondering why the front of the ship looks like that. We lost 10 compartments. They were filling up with water. We used to have drills all the time where the collision alarm would go off. The collision alarm on the ship is the most terrifying sound, even if it's just a drill. And what you were supposed to do was grab your life jacket, remain where you are, and wait for instructions if we have to abandon ship. Well, remember, I'm down 4 compartments. Everybody's in bed at 1:30 in the morning, and that collision alarm goes off, and this is not a drill. And so everybody gets up, as they're supposed to, and they grab the life preservers that are in the corner of the compartment, and we have guys that are going wild already. They're already in panic mode. So they head for the stairs so that we could come up out of our compartment. And one of the jobs of the sailors in a collision situation is to make the ship as airtight as possible. And down comes this 200-pound door right in their face, and the wheel is turned, and we are sealed in airtight in our compartment. So in case the ship sinks, it doesn't sink as slowly. Great comfort. So, guys are screaming. Sergeant Villanueva, who doesn't know how to swim, is first in line, and he's banging on the hatch. And he looks around, and Sergeant Perfetto is getting back in bed. What in the blazes is wrong with you, Perfetto? I says, what are we going to do? They haven't given the order to evacuate ship. Can you get through that hatch? Is there anything you can do? All of your yelling and screaming is just taking up more oxygen. I'm going back to sleep until they give the order to evacuate ship or secure us from abandoned ship drill. Or it's not a drill. About 4 hours later, After I'd slept a couple of hours, they said, you can come out of your compartments now, and we could come up and we could take a look at the damage. But what was all that panic? When we are in danger, maybe we've gotten a diagnosis of cancer, or maybe we're in a car wreck or something like that, and we've gotten some injuries. Is there any reason for us as Christians to panic? Or is our God not there? Has he promised to take care of us? Is he not a help in time of trouble? Has he said, I will never leave you or forsake you? There is no reason for us to fear for anything. Ahaz is out of his mind with fear. Do you make good decisions when you are controlled by your emotions? No. You will not pay attention to common sense. You will not pay attention to reason and the facts. This is why Isaiah says to him, listen, be quiet, and do not fear, so you can understand what I'm about to tell you. And do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands. Now, why does he call them that? Because they've lost their fire. They're not even dangerous anymore when you've got the Lord on your side. So that's how he describes them. This fierce anger of Rezin and Syria, the son of Remaliah. Because Syria with Ephraim, you remember I told you that sometimes the northern kingdom, Israel, would be referred to by the name of its capital. Sometimes the whole country is called Samaria because Samaria is its capital. Sometimes the whole country, which consists of 10 tribes, is going to be referred to by the chief of those 10 tribes, who is Ephraim. So when he talks about Syria and he talks about Ephraim, he's talking about the countries of Syria and Israel. They've devised evil against you, saying, let's go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of Tabeel as king in the middle of it. Thus says Yahweh God, ain't gonna happen, not on my watch. God says, it shall not stand, it shall not come to pass. So, Ahaz says, oh, thank the Lord. You think that's how Ahaz responds? He doesn't. He doesn't have any confidence in Yahweh whatsoever. Do you know why? Because Ahaz has not been doing things God's way. And he knows deep down inside that there is absolutely no human or heavenly reason whatsoever that God should get him out of this jam that he's in. And so rather than take God at his word, what does Ahaz do? Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria. Now, I don't want you mixing up Assyria with Syria. Two different countries. Next door, but two different countries. And he sent messengers up to the king of Assyria saying, I'm your servant, I'm your slave, and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria, because Yahweh has promised to do it, but I don't trust him a bit. And from the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was in the house of the Lord. What's the house of the Lord? That's the temple. Where does the silver and gold come from that is in the treasury of the temple of God? It comes from the tithes, the offerings of the people, and of the people that go to war, because whenever they conquer and God gives them victory, 1/10 of the spoil goes to God, and this is how the treasuries of the temple of God are built up. And if he's taking those treasuries, he is stealing from God. Ever stolen from God? Ever used what belongs to God to go on vacation? Or something else that you want? Not only does he take the treasures of the house of the Lord, but he dips into his own treasures. And he sent a gift wrapped with a bow on top present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria listened to Ahaz. And what did he do? The king of Assyria marched up against Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. And he took it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and he killed Rezin. And so Jerusalem is rescued. Ahaz put his faith in the wrong army, not the army of God. This is going to come back and bite him. Now let's see if I can show this for you on a map. This will make it visually easier to understand. You see over there toward the left side, you see Israel and Judah. Two different countries. That used to be one country called Israel, and now there are two countries called Israel, 10 tribes, and Judah, 2 tribes. The capital of Judah is Jerusalem. That's where the action was taking place. Aram has, from where we get the word Aramean, there's a country up there in purple or pink, however you see it, with the capital of Damascus. That's Syria. And if you remember, Syria has been picking on Israel and dipping into Israel's territory and taking their people captive and diminishing the size of the country of Israel. So they have been enemies for a long time now. Suddenly, they are friends. And the two of them are ganging up on the country of Judah, and they have surrounded Jerusalem. Do you know why? Because they had gone to Judah and said, we need you to join forces with us because there's a bigger threat to all three of us, and that is the country of Assyria. And Judah would not cooperate. So they said, we're going to attack Judah, and we're going to set up our own king, Tabeel. And God says, ain't going to happen. Now, you see Assyria up there in the yellow. You see its capital, Nineveh. Is that making you remember anything else about what we've gone over in the Old Testament? Jonah. God said to Jonah, who lived in Israel, I want you to go to Nineveh and preach against the city. But the Assyrians were a threat to Israel. And Jonah says, okay, but instead, he gets in the water on a ship heading west in that big blue part called the Mediterranean Sea, headed for Spain. Tarshish, it was called. Well, God gets a fish involved and spits Jonah back up on Israel, and he says, now go to Nineveh. And Jonah says, yes, sir. So that's what's going on during this time. But Assyria, which appears small on this map, soon will occupy just about everything you see on this map except the country of Judah. They will absolutely take over Syria and Israel, and Turkey, which is north of that, and all the way over to Babylon. Assyria is one of those strange kingdoms that keeps, well, it's like a friend of mine. Every other time that I see this guy, he's 100 pounds less or 100 pounds more. We call him the yo-yo because he's always losing a lot of weight and he's gaining a lot of weight. Well, Assyria was like that. There were times in history when Assyria was very, very weak. And then it would get really strong. And then it would get really, really weak. Just for short periods of time. And then it got really, really strong. And that's the period that we're discussing now. And during this strong period, it's going to attack Israel. And it's going to remove Israel, the northern country, from being a country and scatter them throughout all of the nations. That's the country that's responsible. But it's a very, very short-lived, strong period, because the Babylonians are going to take over and wipe out Assyria forever. But that's for a later time. So the Lord, being very patient, talks again to King Ahaz. And he says, ask a sign of the Lord. Speed limit, 55. No, a different kind of sign. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. In other words, as deep as the grave in the ground or as high as the clouds in the sky. But Ahaz, in false piety, says, I'm not going to ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. You remember? That's from Deuteronomy. You shall not put the Lord your God to a test. But this is the Lord requesting Ahaz and giving him permission to do it. It's like, Ahaz, do you need any more assurance that I am going to take care of you and my people in Judah? And Ahaz doesn't want to hear from the Lord. So he says, I will not put the Lord to the test. People have more excuses because think about this. If the Lord does give him a sign and does come through for him, then Ahaz has absolutely no excuse for not bowing down before the Lord. And he doesn't want to bow down before the Lord. So, Isaiah, who's speaking for the Lord, says, all right, listen up then, O house of David. Why does he address Ahaz as house of David? Because he's a descendant of King David. Is it too little for you that you're wearing out men, making them weary, that you are attempting to wear out my God also? So you're not going to request a sign. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. We ever heard that before? Yeah. Where did we hear that? We hear that just before the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ, who will one day deliver Israel from all of its troubles. Now, this is going to be a little complicated, but I'm here to teach you to think theologically through the Scriptures so that you can read it and interpret it yourselves. You know how it's quoted in the New Testament. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. A virgin is somebody who has never had sexual relations with a man. How can somebody who has never had sexual relations with a man bear a child? She can't. Then how did Mary? Because the child was not conceived by a man or the result of a sexual relationship. The Holy Spirit came upon Jesus' mother, and that's how Jesus was conceived. There was not a man involved, and therefore Mary could be a virgin. Now, why isn't it translated that way in the Revised Standard Version, which I have up here on the screen? Why does it say, behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son? Well, Alma in the Hebrew is assumed to be a virgin because it means that she is a young maiden. But this is not a miraculous birth, because as soon as an Alma, a young woman, has sexual relations, she conceives and bears a son. It's the usual way. And This woman, we'll find out, is Isaiah's wife. And what do they call the child? Emmanuel, which means God is with us. This child that is going to be born to Isaiah and his wife is going to be a sign to Israel that God is with them to take care of them and to sustain them. Now, of this child, Isaiah says, he shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. That means he's going to grow up enough, at least to the age where he can discern right from wrong. But before that happens, he says, for before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before the two kings of whom you are in dread will be deserted. That means there will be no more Syria, there will be no more Israel, and it's going to happen before this child can discern right from wrong. And that's what the Lord says. And the child that Isaiah and his wife bear is going to be a sign that the Lord is going to come through and do this very thing. And sure enough, he does this very thing. Now, in the very next chapter, in Isaiah chapter 8, Isaiah says, behold, I and the children, that's plural, children implies at least two. The children whom the Lord has given me are what? They're signs. They're signs and omens in Israel from the Lord of hosts. They are going to communicate something prophetic from the Lord. So, okay, the first child is Emmanuel. And he's trying to communicate with that name that God is with Judah, his people. But there's going to be another child born. How did Isaiah get two children? Well, I don't know if this prophetess is his wife or he just has relations with her, but it says, I went into the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-shalal-hash-baz. All right, you know what I'm going to say. Say it with me. People, don't name your children Maher-shalal-hash-baz. You know that's the longest name in the Bible? Yeah, I want you to memorize that name. Okay. You know what it means? It means quick to the spoil. Quick to the spoil. And I'll show you the significance of that in a minute. For before this child knows how to cry, my mom or my father, my mother, which is very early, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria, that's Israel, will be carried away before the king of Assyria. So God is going to use the Assyrians to punish the Syrians and the Israelites very soon, too. So, Isaiah's two children are what? They are signs of what God is going to do. Now, let's go back to the original statement. Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son. How would that have been a sign for Ahaz that God was going to come through for them if Ahaz had to wait 700 years until Jesus Christ was born for him to see the sign from God? It isn't. And this is the nature of many prophecies in the Old Testament. There is an immediate sign. There is an immediate fulfillment. But this is ultimately fulfilled in the birth of Jesus Christ, who will be the ultimate deliverer of his people. And he does this in two ways. He does it by virtue of the cross, because he first delivers his people from their sins. And then when he returns, he delivers them from their enemies. And folks, you can't expect much from God if you have not turned to him to deliver you first from your sins. Okay, so remember, King Ahaz and the king of Assyria are chummy now because the king of Assyria has helped him in a situation in which Syria and Israel have surrounded Jerusalem. So, when that's all over, King Ahaz went up to Damascus because Damascus is the capital of Syria, or at least it was, until the king of Assyria came in and took over. So, that's where the king Tiglath-Pileser is, and King Ahaz goes up to Damascus to meet him, and he saw the altar that was at Damascus. Now, what do you think that they sacrifice on that altar, and who do you think they worship? The Lord God? I don't think so. And King Ahaz is impressed with this altar, and he sent down to Uriah the high priest a model of the altar in its patterns, exact in all its details. The guy is so stupid, all he had to do was take a picture of it with his cell phone. And Uriah the priest, ever faithful to God, built the altar in accordance with all King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it before King Ahaz even arrived back from Damascus. And when the king did come back from Damascus, the king took a look at the altar. And the king drew near to the altar, and he went up on it, and he burnt his burnt offerings and his cereal offerings, Captain Crunch, I assume, and poured his drink offering and threw the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. And my guess is, even though this is set up at the temple of God, that he was not worshiping God with these sacrifices. And the bronze altar, which is supposed to be used for worship of Yahweh, which was before the Lord, he removed it from the front of the house, from the place between his altar and the house of the Lord, and he put it on the north side of his altar. Therefore, because he was determined not to listen to or to worship Yahweh, Yahweh his God gave him into the hand of the king of Syria, who defeated him and took captive a great number of his people and brought them to Damascus. He was also given into the hand of the king of Israel, who also defeated him with a great slaughter. And who did he go to for help? He went to Assyria to help him. But God gives him into their hand anyway. For Pekah, the son of Remaliah, slew 120,000 soldiers in Judah in one day, all of them men of valor, because they had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. The men of Israel took 200,000 of their kinfolk, women, sons, and daughters, as captives, and they took very much spoil, gold, silver, jewelry, clothing, etc., and brought this spoil up to Samaria, which is the capital of Israel. And a prophet of the Lord was there, whose name was Oded. And he went out to meet the army that came to Samaria, and he said to them, Behold, because the Lord, the God of your fathers, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. Friends, let me tell you this. If you belong to God, and you are not paying attention to him, he will bring people into your life who will do you wrong until you turn back to the Lord. And this is what he did with his own people, Judah. He brought armies against Judah, namely Israel. He brought them, and he gave them into your hand, but you have slain them in a rage that has reached up to heaven. And now you intend to subjugate the people of Judah and Jerusalem, male and female, as your slaves? Do you not have sins of your own against Yahweh, your God? Remember, Israel is God's people also. And let me set the time frame for you. Israel, the northern kingdom, has only about 12 to 15 years left to exist. You remember? God sent them prophets saying, turn back to the Lord. More prophets, turn back to the Lord. They didn't. They kept getting more evil and more evil and more evil because they got the kings that were more evil and more evil and more evil. And because of that, the people did not listen. And the prophets kept saying, turn back to the Lord. So God decided to turn up the volume. He sent 2 prophets, Elijah and Elisha, with miracles. Pay attention. God means business. He's got the power to do this stuff against you, but he also has the power to provide for you. Turn back to him. Did they listen to Elijah and Elisha? And guess what? He stopped speaking to them. And when God stops speaking to you, you know you're in trouble. And these guys have just a little over a decade left before the Assyrian army is going to come down, rape their women, kill their men, steal their children, drive them out of the land, and replace them with people from other countries. Do you not have sins of your own against the Lord your God? And the men who have been mentioned by name rose, and they took those captives with the spoil. They clothed all those who were naked, gave them sandals, provided food and drink, anointed them. That means that they put oil on their wounds. And they carried all the feeble among them on donkeys. They cared for them. And they brought them to their kinfolk at Jericho, which is on the border between Israel, the northern country, and Judah, the southern country. And at that time, King Ahaz sent again to the king of Assyria for help. I need your help again. God had given him the signs of 2 children that Isaiah had. But he refused to listen to the Lord. And why does he turn to the king of Assyria this time? Because the Edomites, that's south of the Dead Sea, had again invaded and defeated Judah and carried away captives. And the Philistines had made raids on the cities in the Shephelah. The Shephelah are the plains that are next to the coastal area where most of the fruit and vegetables and stuff are grown in Israel. The Shephelah and the Negev of Judah, that's the southern part. And they had taken Beth Shemeth, which is only 7.5 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Aijalon, Gadaroth, Sukkah with its villages, Timnah with its villages, and Gimzo with its villages, and they settled there. They didn't just take the people captive and destroy the cities. They moved in. This is part of their territory now. For the Lord brought Judah very low because of Ahaz, king of Israel, for he dealt wantonly in Judah and had been faithless to the Lord. So, who is attacking the country of Judah? Israel has attacked and defeated. Syria has attacked and defeated. The Philistines have attacked and defeated. The Edomites have attacked and defeated. Oh, we've got another one. Look at that last sentence. So Tiglath-Pileser, to whom Ahaz had just gone for help, came against him also, and he afflicted him instead of strengthening him. Isn't that great? God will turn people against you, especially if you have depended upon them for help instead of God. Why are we so reluctant to depend upon God and to trust him with the evil stuff in our lives? So in his time of distress, he turned to the Lord, right? Nope. He became yet more faithless to the Lord. This same King Ahaz, and it's not like he doesn't have history. You remember King Asa? King Asa, a really, really good king, and every time he depended upon the Lord, even going up against a 1 million man army from Ethiopia, he won every time he depended upon the Lord. But when he sought help from the Syrians for a much smaller army, wrath came upon Asa. So it's not like King Ahaz doesn't have a whole bunch of kings who have made the same mistakes and those who have depended upon the Lord, and God has given them victory, Ahaz has no excuse whatsoever. You do know what the definition of insanity is, don't you? You keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And over again, this guy is not going to trust the Lord, but he's going to turn to the world for his cure, for whatever ails him. And he sacrificed to the gods of Damascus, which had defeated him. He says, because the gods of the kings of Syria helped them, why not turn to your own God? I'm going to sacrifice to them. Maybe they'll help me. But they were the ruin of him and all Israel. And Ahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city in Jerusalem, for they did not bring him into the tombs of the kings of Israel. And Hezekiah his son reigned in his place. Hezekiah, who had escaped being burned and offered to the god of Moloch as one of his father's sacrifices, became one of the best kings in the history of God's people. And we're going to be discussing that in the days to come. There will be no gloom for her. This is back to Isaiah's prophesying during this period. Now let me tell you who he's talking about. He's talking about the northern kingdom, Israel, which is about to be thrown out of the land. There will be no gloom for her that was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. Now, who are those guys? Those are two of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they settled in the northern part of the land that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just to the west of the Sea of Galilee. You know, where we find Nazareth. But in the latter time, Isaiah says, in other words, sometime down in the future, God will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them that light has shined. Have you heard that before? Hopefully, if you were with me when I went over the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus departs from his Judean ministry and heads north into Galilee, this quote comes from Isaiah chapter 9. Those who have dwelt in darkness have seen the great light. And who is that great light? Jesus Christ. And folks, something you're going to discover, that the greatest prophecies about God delivering his people, Israel, always fall in the Old Testament during the times when Israel and Judah are at their spiritual worst. And God says, doesn't make any difference how much I whip you, I am also going to win you. And you will be mine, and I will be your God. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. Has Israel ever done this? Nope. This is for the latter times. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the trampling warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for fire. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. And the government, when the government is upon his shoulder, and was the government upon his shoulder when he came the first time? No, he never ascended the throne of David his father. But when he does come back, he will sit on that throne, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called by whom? By God's people, Israel. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. They will never, ever be conquered again. Upon the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Folks, if you are wandering from God after having come to know him, and he has been sending messengers or messages from the pulpit or from the things that you are reading or for family members or friends who care about you, please return to me. Know that God is going to do whatever it takes. He will bring whatever disaster is necessary upon us to bring us back into his fold, because that's our God. Great is his faithfulness, and the Lord, the zeal of the Lord of hosts, will do this. Have every confidence that this very same God is going to restore Israel, the very people who crucified our Christ, because of his great faithfulness. And he will take care of us as well. So, if man is against us, is there anyone who is for us? And if he is for us, is there any reason to fear?